Good morning, folks. My name is Kshitij Kumar. I'm a director from Microsoft Dart.
Hey, my name's Roberto Bamberger. I'm an analyst in Microsoft's detection and response team, or DART. As a thank you for showing up, if some of my colleagues in the front row can raise their hand there. Yeah, we got some cookies up here. We just decided to leave them laying around so you can come and grab some, just like these threat actors do. So please, I'm serious, there really are cookies. Please come get some.
Take the cookies, no malware required. We'll talk about the malware in a sec.
Yep.
And I have to actually start by apologizing for what is going to be most likely an excessive use of cookie-related puns, jokes, and analogies for the next 30 minutes. So hopefully all of you enjoyed the humor that we try to put into this for what ends up actually being a pretty fun topic. All right.
Attempted humor.
Attempted humor.
Attempted humor, yeah. I mean, we're engineers, so. Yeah.
Alrighty. So to kick this talk off, we want to start with just a quick primer, an overview of what cookies and tokens are and why we see threat actors going after them as often as we do. Then we'll get into the dough of this presentation, which will be some case studies on 3 particular threat actors that we've seen using and abusing cookies in their particular attacks or techniques. Probably some familiar names, including a talk that we had from yesterday on Nobelium, might tie in a little bit, and there's going to be actually another Microsoft talk tomorrow about, they may not say that it's LAPSUS, but it's, we'll pause there. And then we'll finally wrap up with some lessons, recommendations, some things we want to evangelize to you and hope that you kind of take away and help us spread the good word on how to better protect customers everywhere. All right, sound like a plan? I'll take that as a yes. So, out of curiosity, this may be just me, but I'll ask the question, did anyone else have the experience growing up where, as a kid, you've been duped by an oatmeal raisin cookie and you absolutely hated everything about it? It's not a chocolate chip cookie, it sucks, whatever. But now as an adult, you started to discover that oatmeal raisin cookies aren't all that terrible. Like, they're nothing, yeah, see, at least there's somebody, at least I'm not alone. Thank you, I appreciate that. A similar paradigm shift is something we've noticed in our world of incident response investigations, in that the good stuff has changed a little bit. We used to see in our investigations, the priority was always getting data collected on servers, especially when we were doing on-premises investigations. Get the servers first, workstations will follow, it'll be fine. What's changed is the good stuff is no longer so much on on-premises servers. They're still there. You can still pull files off file shares. That's all there. But a lot of the useful information, the stuff that attackers want to do reconnaissance with, credentials, secrets, things, passwords.txt, have started to end up on SharePoint. There's secrets on AWS buckets and the like. So the good stuff has moved to the cloud. So our adversary friends have also decided to start pivoting to the cloud. The other piece for why we're seeing such an uptick in cookie and token theft and token replay is that attackers have noticed that we've beat the MFA drum in the security world pretty well. A lot of folks have begun implementing MFA. They've done a really good job of it. And attackers, well, we know in the security space that there's a bit of an interplay between blue and red, where blue puts a control in place, red has to figure out how to bypass it. Lo and behold, we beat MFA, cookie theft has risen as a bypass for that control. And it's actually picked up to such an extent that there's been what we call a democratization of this technique, where it doesn't really take as much sophistication as we used to believe it did to actually accomplish this technique and use it to get into the quote-unquote good stuff. So we'll talk a bit more about that closer to the end of the presentation, especially as we get into our LAPSUS case study. And with that, I'll pivot over to Roberto to tell us a bit about cookies, tokens.
At the core, why do we care about cookies? And when it comes to web-based authentication, when it comes to OAuth or OIDC, these cookies are pretty much stored as the tokens for access, whether it's an access token, which are short-lived, usually about an hour, refresh tokens, which can be much longer lived. Some of them are only 24 hours, some of them are 14 days, and by and large, a lot of them are 90 days. But those tokens get stored in the cookies that are stored on the client device. If I'm a threat actor interested like in espionage and I want to be monitoring your email, if I can compromise the end user's device where they have already authenticated and have a cookie that says that MFA has already been satisfied, that's kind of the edge, that crispy outer edge of the cookie, which allows you to get to the gooey good stuff, the chocolatey, rich, fudgy kind of inside stuff, or the target's email, right? So one of the things I want you to walk out of this session with is, where does the cloud start? We always think about the cloud as these servers and data centers and everything else, but you access the cloud from a device. So the cloud actually starts, and protecting your cloud assets, and actually also your on-prem assets, starts at the edge. And that edge is the device which people are using to authenticate into those assets. So yes, the threat actor cares about that gooey goodness on the inside, but we have to care about the edge. So tokens are stored in cookies. Those are usually in client browsers. Some of the more popular browsers will store it in a SQLite database, and the cookies are encrypted most of the time, and a lot of times using DPAPI for encryption. But as the user, if I can compromise, Kshitij's account, it has the ability to decrypt its own cookies. So I may not need an elevation of privilege. Or we've also seen, more than likely, threat actors also compromising domain controllers at the domain level, getting domain admin credentials, which allows them to go access the domain backup keys for DPAPI, which means they can decrypt anything in the enterprise that's stored in DPAPI. So it's not a high bar for the threat actor to steal cookies, decrypt them, and apply them. So steal the cookie means you steal the token. If I have the token, I can authenticate as that user. If I've already passed MFA, the cloud just thinks, hey, I have done MFA. So we're going to take you through a couple of case studies.
You got the first one?
I'll take the first one, sure. So in this particular case, we won't tell you who the customer is, but we saw quite a bit of interesting things. The threat actor was able to do an on-prem compromise. They were able to gain domain admin, or basically have Active Directory access. They had domain dominance. And then what we saw was the threat actor going and attaching to a bunch of SMB file shares and copying out, I think it was the Firefox in this case, or was it?
A little bit of column A, a little bit of column B.
I think it was Chrome, yeah. But they went and they grabbed all the cookies. And then magically, what we started seeing was the threat actor authenticating as these users whose C$ share and admin $share were accessed as those users. Kind of a problem, right? And it turns out that those users were not normal users. They were users that actually had global admin privileges, not into my customer's cloud tenant, but into their customers' cloud tenants. So this was actually one of the things we've observed in compromising cloud solution providers. So I, as a threat actor, if I can compromise one of those organizations, and we talked about this last year at MWise, I get a lot of bang for my buck because I didn't just compromise one organization. Cloud solution providers, they may have, thousands of customers that now the threat actor has the equivalent of global admin privileges. Now, one of the changes that Microsoft made to the cloud solution provider program was Great. If you're doing administrative things in your customer's tenants, you have to be using multi-factor authentication. Well, threat actor has a claim in that cookie that says, I've already authenticated with multi-factor authentication. So let's go on. So we've seen lots of, Nobelium has definitely done this. We also see some other threat actors doing very similar things. So think about Nobelium as really sophisticated, both technically and OPSEC-wise. And we're also going to tell you about some threat actors who maybe not as good at OPSEC.
Oh, yeah. Which will be, I think, the third case study. The next one we'll talk about is for an actor that is currently unnamed. We don't really have an element name for them or anything like that at Microsoft, but it is from a particular investigation that we had done semi-recently, in the past year. This particular actor did what we were calling, just between friends, authentication teleportation, where this investigation kind of began. I guess I'll start with this part of the story, where the customer in question was given a particular IP address and told that this is a malicious IP address by a third party. So they brought in Dart to help with the investigation. We started doing what any investigative team normally does when given an atomic indicator like that, which is to boil the ocean. Run that IP address through every single possible data source where we might see IP addresses and see if anything falls out, if we shake those trees. We did this for both on-prem resources as well as cloud resources. When we ran this IP address through, if you're familiar with the unified audit log in Azure, that allowed us to actually start seeing that there was a single particular user account with which that IP address had been associated as downloading massive amounts of data out of SharePoint, like thousands and thousands of files. And just the one user account within a very particular time range. So now we've got some threads to go pull, so we started trying to figure out, okay, well, we see the SharePoint activity come from that particular IP address. Was it credential theft? It turns out no, because the most recent actual sign-on activity that occurred for that user right before the mass amounts of download out of SharePoint were not from that same IP address. The authentication event came from the user's workstation's IP address from his BYOD home workstation device. So level set that. Authentication is happening over here with a known good device, and immediately following, we are seeing massive download from SharePoint from a completely different IP address. So we had to ask ourselves, how did the authentication teleport? How did it go from point A to point B? And so we did, again, pursue... Go ahead.
Couldn't their network connection, their VPN have dropped, or could they be using a split tunnel VPN to achieve this, or?
Totally possible, but we decided to actually go chase the workstation. So we pulled the investigative thread further. In this particular case, the customer already had Microsoft Defender for Endpoint as their EDR, so we started with the data that was available to us. And digging in, you can see the very first event in the timeline, which was that there was, in fact, a network connection event from Edge, the browser, hitting login.microsoftonline.com on that particular user's workstation. Followed pretty much immediately by 5 get clipboard data events. It turns out that if we look even a little bit further in the timeline, not shown on this slide, is that the actor had RDP'd into that workstation, that particular user's workstation, from yet another workstation, and then gone ahead and used Edge to fire up login.microsoft.com, make sure those cookies are loaded, and most likely proceeded to fire up something like Edge or Chrome developer tools. Both of these browsers have this capacity to simply view the cookies, copy them, and then take them over RDP clip back home to whichever workstation they were on previously, and then back to their known bad infrastructure. Just to show how absolutely simple it is, in the bottom right screenshot, if you can see that on the screen, that is me pulling up my own cookies on my own device from my Edge browser for ESTS auth and all the rest of them that you can see in there. ESTS auth persistent are the cookies that'll have refresh tokens and the like. But there's 2 cookies that we haven't mentioned yet that are in the diagram in the top right-hand corner. And those are the SharePoint RTFA and FedAuth cookies. We believe, based on the analysis that we did of the log data, the activity in SharePoint, and the timeline analysis, that the actor stole not only, in this case, the refresh tokens, but was also replaying the RTFA and FedAuth cookies, which is a technique that we hadn't really seen before. The core of the story that I want to get across is that it's not ultimately just about the refresh tokens. A lot of folks talk a lot about them, about access tokens and the like, but it turns out different cloud resources use different kinds of tokens. There's a lot of different options out there. And right now, I know our talk is more focused on Microsoft, Azure, and how we access the cloud, but think about the other variety of tokens that are out there for, again, AWS, for GCP, for VMware, for whatever resources you may be trying to access in the cloud.
And a lot of cloud applications, whether it's Microsoft properties or third-party properties, yes, they rely on things like OAuth for the authentication piece and use refresh tokens, but some of them have other access tokens buried inside of them. And the threat actors are finding those and saying, gosh, if I just grab that one, then maybe things like conditional access policies aren't going to apply. And we see that activity as well.
So question for you, Roberto.
Yep.
Isn't it true that just having such a complex system means that attackers aren't going to figure this stuff out? Shouldn't just having this level of complexity be a blocker?
Yeah, I'm not a big believer in security through obscurity. No, they're going to find it.
They're going to find it.
I mean, these people are resourceful. And a lot of these techniques are well understood and published by security researchers. They're constantly looking for, are we doing the right levels? Are we, the software industry, doing the right levels of verification that that token, that cookie is coming from the place it's supposed to be coming from, and that we have some confidence in its integrity? However, as I alluded to earlier, in the real world, we have situations like split tunnel VPN. We have people roaming. And so just using an atomic indicator like, well, if the IP address changes, I'm going to force you to re-authenticate. At some point, we have to have usable security. We have to have, we have to allow people to be productive and at the same time secure. And it's a difficult balance.
Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Oh, actually ties in well to the next case study, which is one of my favorites, about LAPSUS. If you're familiar with this particular group, they hit the news pretty wildly at the beginning of this particular year. They had a variety of techniques to get initial access to customer environments, ranging from literally bribing insiders to some very clever social engineering, and in this particular case, basically buying stuff off of the darker parts of the internet. In this particular case, we're actually going to see what looks like, from the data that we had, a refresh token replay. We can see the very first item in the timeline, that there's a known legitimate authentication. We talked to the user, made doubly sure with them from that particular user's BYOD workstation that they use for both corporate access as well as personal use, originating from their known good home IP address with the browser that they use on a daily basis. We can see that authentication. We got that in the logs. Makes perfect sense. 2 days after this authentication, most likely through their use of their personal stuff on that particular device, we see Redline Stealer was detected, but not in this case blocked on the attacker's workstation, on the user's workstation, pardon me. A little bit after that, item 3 in the timeline, we see that the LAPSUS does what they need to do to start ruining this customer's dinner by replaying that same token that we saw very early on in the timeline, on the 24th. A week later, that same particular session ID rears its head again, but from a completely different device, different IP address, and not the same browser. If you can see that, it might be a little bit small, but the little red box in the corner, you can see that there's in fact the same session ID, completely different device. This was a pretty easy way for LAPSUS to get their foot in the door. We're not clear as to whether they were able to purchase that, if they were themselves using Redline Stealer, but one way or another in the case of this investigation, we see Redline followed by the authentication teleportation, or as Roberto also likes to call it, Immaculate authentication. Yeah. So what can somebody do with this kind of access? What did LAPSUS do? Again, if you've watched the news, then you'll know that they were, well, they were an extortion group that really wanted to kind of get clout. And in this particular case, that's no difference. Their interest was getting that initial access, using that initial access to go after the good stuff, like we talked about very early on. Go review everything in SharePoint, figure out, well, how do I get on the VPN? How do I register at my own MFA device? They find those documentations on the internet, on the SharePoint. They go ahead and register their own MFA device so that they can have persistence. Then they use that understanding of how the VPN works to get into the VPN and start doing two major actions and objectives. One, they went and downloaded whole code repositories, and two, they started mass deleting virtual machines, just so they said they could.
Mm-hmm. How many of you are incident responders? Anybody? Okay, good. How many of you are responsible for security in your organization? All right, so finish this sentence for me. We require multi-factor authentication to access these resources unless, anyone? Oh, yeah, that's a Microsoft guy, doesn't count. Yeah, unless you're coming from my trusted corporate network. Anybody ever seen that before or had that conversation with your customers? So one of the things we are going to recommend is, well, yes, I can bypass multi-factor authentication. I really can. I can steal cookies to do that. However, it's still a great speed bump. And what we're seeing and what we saw in this example is that the threat actor, so LAPSUS, Nobelium, the other unnamed ones, they've developed the capability to move fluidly from the cloud to on-prem, from on-prem to the cloud, right? And a lot of this has to do with stealing identities on identity takeovers, right? So we see this over and over again. So one of the main points, again, is where those identities are stored, right? Where those access cookies, where those access tokens, where those refresh tokens, where those session tokens are stored, that is, something that has to be protected and monitored at the right level. We've talked a little bit about BYOD. So that's usually a risk area for a lot of our customers right now.
And that actually goes into the next piece here, which is we'll talk a little bit about that democratization. It's not just Redline Stealer. There's also Raccoon Stealer. Even Mimikatz in this day and age has cookie decryption capabilities baked right into the software. You can download Mimikatz off of GitHub right now and go use it, and it'll do it for you for free. This is not hard. This is not the kind of thing that you're only seeing associated, like we said, with sophisticated actors. We're seeing even LAPSUS, who allegedly, according to various news articles, might not be terribly old. These are techniques that have become commodity, have become commoditized, which speaks a lot, as Roberto's getting at, to the risk that we end up taking on and we see customers take on in their environments. Where we want to really focus, like I said, the paradigm has always been chocolate chip cookies. Let's look at servers. Let's make sure the servers are protected. Make sure you've got antivirus. Make sure you've got EDR running on the servers. Workstations have been an afterthought, and that's where these stealers, these pieces of commodity garbage, have already been living for potentially ages, and they've been potentially stealing credentials for potentially ages, and those credentials have been sold en masse for potentially ages. So we've always talked about commodity as kind of a good bellwether for the potential hygiene of an environment. This is where that kind of comes to a head, where if we're not paying attention to it, this is how the actors are going to get in. They're going to start doing bad things. And again, the LAPSUS one hits really close to home because, again, it doesn't take all that much sophistication.
And as a defender, maybe your security operations center playbooks need to be updated a little bit, because a lot of times, things on just an end user's workstation, I fell for a fish, that kind of thing, they are not viewed as serious risks to the organization in many organizations, right? It's like, we reset the password, we're good. Oh, but they've been listening to us. We reset the password and we revoked all of their refresh tokens. Okay, good. That's good. That's good. However, a lot of times the investigation ends there. We need to be starting to think about, well, that workstation, that device, and honestly, one challenge for a lot of security operations centers are these BYOD devices, which maybe they don't even have the authority to go and investigate, right? I mean, we've run into those situations where that's a personal device and the user's telling me, no, you can't look at it. Anybody ever run into that situation before? I have.
Yep.
So there's a lot of nuance to this, but we need to start assessing the potential risk and making that risk management decision. We can't just say, oh, it was just somebody, who got phished or got spoofed, and there wasn't any sensitive data on that system, so we don't care.
Right.
You have to say, well, accessing that system, what does it give me access to? What is the kill chain here?
Right.
And we're not saying anything new about incident response that we've never said before, right? It's just thinking about the scope. We're going to talk really briefly about one last piece, which is recently, over the last 3 or 4 months, we have seen a large uptick in basically adversary in the middle phishing, meaning that it's phishing as a service or FAS platforms like Evil Proxy or EvilGenix. There's a link at the bottom of the slide to an excellent article written by our Microsoft Threat Intelligence colleagues on the rise of this. We published it, I believe, in
August, very recently.
June. That was June.
Yeah, that was June. There you go.
And really good details on it. That's where I acquired, I didn't steal, leveraged the figure from. And actually, it's kind of funny because if you go and look at all these articles that are out there about adversary in the middle, they all have the exact same figure. But kind of flattery for us. But here, the user, through a phishing attack, is presented with a login page. Right? Hey, I got this really important thing. I think one of the most recent ones was your salary has increased,
yep.
Right? Looking like it comes from internal HR. Great, you click on the link. The link takes you to what looks exactly like the Microsoft login page. User enters their creds. Evil Proxy proxies those creds onto the Microsoft backend. Gets the response back and says, oh, you need to satisfy MFA. User uses, their MFA, even if it's the passwordless one where you got to enter a code. Great, I enter that into my Evil Proxy. Evil Proxy sends it on Microsoft. Boom, Evil Proxy now has a session token and a refresh token and an access token. Fantastic. Usually what we will see is within 24 hours, that session token, did I really steal the cookie? Or did I just fool you into giving me the cookie, right?
It's like
doesn't
taking
matter.
a cookie from a baby.
The threat actor now has access to your resources. So adversary in the middle, a lot of times we think about this from a business email compromise perspective, but we are concerned that if you go and search for Evil Proxy out there, they've got YouTube videos, they tell you how much they charge for an hour, of their service and everything else. It's, wonderful phishing as a service. So they've democratized access. So the users don't even have to, the threat actors don't even have to stand up their own infrastructure for this. So, Microsoft is working really hard to shut these things down as quickly as we find them. But that's another way that people are getting these cookies.
So what this gets at, and I'll let Roberto talk about the details, but at the end of the day, though we've talked about things that have changed, the paradigms that have shifted, and even new particular techniques like adversary in the middle and EvilGenX 2, the things that these actors have been doing, the fundamentals actually haven't changed all that much. The recommendations that we're going to give might diverge in terms of the technology stacks and in terms of the specifics, but the core of it, the dough of it, has not really modified.
Mm-hmm. So we're going to talk about some things about making it actionable. Believe it or not, I'm still going to tell you that even though a threat actor can defeat multi-factor authentication, we do think that it's a great security control to be implementing because it makes them work that much harder. We recommend to people, if you can avoid it, do not have that exclusion for my corporate IP addresses, right? There's really no point to doing that. Enable users to report MFA fraud. In our MFA platform, there's a button that says, no, it wasn't me, right? And that will get routed to your security operations team, plus Microsoft gains intelligence on that, and we can start looking for trends there. Protect the user endpoints. It's about the material, including things like access tokens, session tokens, refresh tokens, all the cookies, right, that allow you to do all this seamless single sign-on. That's the good stuff, or at least those are the keys to getting to the good stuff. So we need to start thinking a little bit differently about which assets are important. But none of this is new, right? 10 years ago, I think it was December 11th, 2012, Microsoft published a Pass the Hash white paper, right? Which talked about, gosh, this pass the hash thing, this is a big problem. You need to start protecting the devices that are being used with domain admin credentials or administrative credentials, right? So the tier 0 stuff, the red forest, all those architectures, right? We really started talking about that, 10 years ago in earnest. I mean, it's not new. People have been talking about security zones for 30 years. But what we thought we had to protect was just privileged access, right? Administrative control. Now we need to really rethink that equation and say, how are we protecting the assets or access to the assets that threat actors are actually interested in, right? If I'm in espionage, I want to be reading your email. If I want to target your on-prem network, I want your architecture, right? I want to know your security architecture. So how do we protect those assets? And we have to protect the cookies which control access to those things. One of the big things that we would love to see people doing, at least for accessing our cloud environments, is require device management. So require managed devices, managed and compliant devices, whatever those policies are, via conditional access controls. Implement conditional access session controls. If you want to really think through it, we do give you a control called sign-in frequency, which says, I don't care how long the refresh token lives. I don't care how long the session token lives. I don't care about any of that. I'm going to require this user, in order to access that resource, to do a fresh, complete sign-in every X hours. Is that going to be annoying to end users? Well, yeah. It's probably less annoying than triggering a major security event. All that will do is it will make the threat actor go in and reacquire access tokens, right? And we actually observed in one case, fairly recently, where we dialed into the threat actor's infrastructure. We were working with the customer. They had we had identified a compromised identity. We'd worked with the customer to reset that password, revoke all of the tokens for it. 28 minutes later, the threat actor, 28 minutes after the user with their new credential and passing MFA, 28 minutes later, we see the threat actor using that new session cookie. Right? 28 minutes. They had that much, capability inside of my customer's network. So we think that by requiring device management, requiring it to be monitored by your SOC, requiring it's going to be compliant with policies, that those will really help. And the other thing is just, be relentless, like Kevin was saying earlier. We have to be relentless. So monitor the risk events, particularly if we're talking about access into Office 365 or Azure Active Directory. We have alerts for anomalous tokens, atypical travel, unfamiliar sign-in properties, malicious IP address, impossible travel, new country, activity from anonymous IP addresses. Yes, those can be noisy, but I have seen all of those fire on single events where there was session cookie theft. So it's really about not becoming a victim of alert and risk fatigue. It's about understanding what you have to investigate.
I'll also add on that we've also seen in situations where some of these alerts have not fired with the highest critical severity. We've had customers only paying attention to those alerts that are firing at that level. That was their unfortunate mistake. That alert was generated saying that you've probably got some shenanigans, but it was only at a high or medium. So it's important, again, in the context of alert fatigue, to figure out a mechanism with your people. Ultimately, it is the people who are going to be staring at the console to make sure that all of these are being triaged. They're all potential leads for that defense of your organization.
I think, is that our last slide?
I think that's our last slide.
I think it is. So if anybody has any questions, come on up to the mic. And if we run out of time, Kshitij and I will be available. And please come grab some cookies from the front row as well, because if not, they're going to wind up in my hotel room, and I don't need them. But I also do not have the self-control to not eat them. So anybody got any questions, thoughts, comments? No one?
Well, we must have answered every question already.
No one's going to ask the hard question? Go to the mic, yeah. So everybody can hear it. All right. We got a runner.
Hi, my name is Jack. I'm based out of Hawaii. Several weeks ago, there was a disclosure about cookies in Microsoft Teams being stored in clear text, I believe. And I was just curious if any guidance on that had been released yet. That's something we've been grappling with internally.
So that one's kind of interesting because the specific thing is, if I go and look at the memory of a running process, or if I open a running process, can I see the cookies? And but I already compromised that endpoint in order to be able to do that. So is there a security boundary being crossed? The security boundary already got crossed in order to replay that cookie. I mean, you can go today, hit F12 in your browser, grab the refresh token, and then use a tool like Postman. Is that a security vulnerability? We don't think it is. Are we taking extra steps to make sure that it cannot be abused in a way that would cross the security boundary? Absolutely.
Good question.
Good question. Fair question.
Thank you. My name is Remy. I'm local here from Washington, D.C. So question is, all your talk was in the context of browser and harvesting cookies. Do you see this happening on mobile devices as well? Do you see attackers maybe moving from mobile and mobile apps and mobile browser to PC, more traditional endpoints?
Mobile devices.
So do we think it's happening? Yes.
Yes.
Have we worked an investigation where we actually have seen it happening? No. However, if we think about defense in depth and what you need to monitor, it's the device which has the cookies, which, if I as the threat actor can compromise that endpoint and steal that material, what does it give me access to? So you should absolutely be including those in your threat matrix.
Yeah.
Your planning.
Good question.
I mean, nobody's taken a cookie. Oh.
All right.
Lisa wants us to stand closer together.
All right.
Nobody's going to ask the hard questions.
Oh.
Like, how do we really defeat this? Right? So the long-term solution, we believe, is to actually tie these cookies to the hardware so that you you pin them to the hardware by cryptologically signing them with something, for example, in a TPM. And that way they cannot be replayed from a different device. That's, we think, is a reasonable long-term solution. That is what we are working on. I have no ETA. It's a hard problem because, as many of you might have noticed, when we rolled out Windows 11, there was an interesting response to requiring a TPM on the device, right?
Yeah.
So not everybody's really ready to have everything tied to, cryptologically signed to a piece of hardware. But that would be the right, we believe, long-term solution. However, the mitigations which we did suggest in that last slide, right, the actionable items there, will help a great deal. But if you only take one thing out of this, which is those BYOD devices, those are really important. And it's not only what the device is, but understanding that the identities which are stored on that device, even in an ephemeral sense, right? They may not be there for forever, but if I can access those identities, those access tokens, those session tokens, those refresh tokens, then I can access the resources that were being protected by those.
Protect the cookie, protect the token.
Yep.
Cool. Thank you all very much. Appreciate your time today.
Yep.